When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Erudition Network Interactive Black History and Knowledge session. I am Eddie Phillips, and I am happy that you are with us. Or if you're going to be one of those who watch the replay or the rebroadcast of this, I will welcome you then in joining us and learning with us. I think this will be the last night in which we will be on this late. My work schedule and things have dictated that. But that being said, we are here tonight. We may go a little earlier in the next couple of weeks, probably around 7 o'clock Mountain Time. But right now we are here. And before we get started tonight, I want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone that has stood by us over these last few months as we have been off and then coming back to do the show. Over the last few shows, I've seen more and more of you saying the same thing. I see viewers say that the channel should have more viewers, that the content deserves more subscribers, and people need to hear this. And I'm going to say to you, all of you who have said that, share, subscribe, send it to your family members, get them to subscribe. I don't take that lightly. I want people to watch the Erudition Network and learn from what it is that we're doing. Because what you're really saying is not just that you enjoy the content, but you're saying that you're getting information that you believe that matters. And I want more people to get that information. So to everyone that has been watching, sharing, commenting, and speaking and out and about the value of the lessons and the things that we have put out, I just want to say thank you. But I also want to encourage you to continue to share because I appreciate you. And more importantly, we need you. We need the voices and the people who are out here who watch this and share this. This is, as you know, we don't do the social media. We're not talking heads. For any one of you that are new here tonight, I will always try to make that clear. We are not a reaction channel. We are not a surface level history channel. This is not a space where we throw out metaphors and opinions dressed up as facts. This is a place where we break down factual historical information in a way that may have not been done with you or for you at any point in time in your life. And this is why we do it. We want facts to dictate, right, what we're looking at. We want evidence. We don't want just folklore and myth. Because we deal in fact-based history, we deal in structure, context, and deeper understanding. And that is important because facts by themselves don't just explain outcomes. Facts without context can lead to some misunderstanding also. So we try to go deep into this enough where you can follow us, understand, and get more out of it than what you may have gotten in general history studies and history books. So that you can get history with structure. that is not repeated to you and it can be regurgitated, but can also show you where to grow your own knowledge and how to move forward in learning. The last week we've talked about systems, and we're going to continue to break things down into a systematic, strategic mentality because I think that's important. We want to ask the questions that most people avoid. We don't, and I don't expect you to agree with everything. That's the other issue. I don't expect you to agree with everything. I want you to challenge what is said. I want you to challenge what we put out, because you need to challenge assumptions. If you feel something is an assumption, you need to challenge that. I want your thoughts. I want your questions, even if you're not participating. I'm tongue-tied tonight in the actual live. I want your interactions. I want you to engage. I want your thoughts, because that's how we learn together, right? Now, with that all being said, let's start where most conversations go wrong. When people talk about racism in the South, they usually reduce it to a simple idea. On this episode, we're going to go a little deeper than that. We're not going to just say that it's racism. We're not just going to say that it's prejudice. We're not going to just say it's people with bad beliefs. Those explanations are too small for what actually existed and what actually impacted Black life in America. We need to go deeper, because what we're about to break down tonight, it is a system, the Southern system. And it was not just prejudice. It was an organized order. And we need to understand that so that we do not repeat that. We need to understand its systematic approach and how organized it was. So we're not just left with the idea that this was unintelligent people doing things or creating systems or structure without any thought. Everything else we talk about tonight will start to make sense once you understand that it was just not just a disorganized structure. Now that if we get past the surface level discussion, we can begin where, as I said, most conversations fail. And that is always with how things are structured. The American South overall, historically, is often explained through the language of prejudice, right? Through the language of racism. Most people approach it that way, justifiably, historically accurate, but they approach it as if it occurred with the simple result of individual attitudes or cultural bias. But the explanation, if you really look at it, is insufficient, because prejudice alone does not create the durable Jim Crow racial code systems that organize labor laws, economics, and behavior across generations. What we are explaining tonight is not a simple racist belief, but a design, a systemic design. When we look at Southern states who practiced heavily in the racist prejudice natures of the South, places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, and on, you're not looking at isolated expressions of racism. You are looking at a coordinated social order built to control Black labor, both before the end of slavery and after. It was designed to restrict Black movement. We talked a little bit about this last week. It was designed to stifle Black voices, Black testimony, and to limit Black aspiration in ways that were reinforced legally. And when it was reinforced legally, that meant economically and culturally, it had a dynamic impact. So, as you hear us talk about this, I want you to consider something. what you've been taught about the South, how you've been taught about its individual behavior, I want you to ask yourself, were you ever shown the system behind that behavior? Was the system ever explained to you? Feel free to chat that in the remarks if you watch this later, or if you're with us here live tonight, and you're on here, feel free to type that in here, right? Either one of those would be good, and we'll get that from you. But I want your interaction. That's what I'm saying. I want your interaction tonight, because that's an important point. Were you ever told about the system, the systemic effects of it, how it was designed? So you see, because when we look at, let's isolate and look at Mississippi. Mississippi stands out because it was uniquely immoral in its laws and what it put out at different times of the American system. But it's not unique in how it necessarily did things. But we can look at it as a clear example of how fully this system could be realized, because Mississippi had a dynamic system. By the late 19th and early 20th century, Mississippi had one of the highest percentages of Black residents in the United States. That's why it's important to look at Mississippi, not because we want to blame everything on Mississippi, but in some counties, Blacks formed the majority of the population. Yet they did not have political, legal, or economic power. That overwhelmingly remained in the hands of whites. That imbalance did not resolve naturally. It did not just stop, right? It did not just continue. It required what all systems require: maintenance. It required a reapproach every now and again to keep it moving. And so then the question becomes, if the majority of the labor force is not the majority of the power structure, if you're working but you have no power, what mechanisms have to exist to preserve the control, right? And more importantly, how visible do these mechanisms have to remain? They have to be seen in order to remain effective. That's what a system is. It's not just a racist act. What has to happen to remain continue its effectiveness? I want you to think about that. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Drop your thoughts and your answers, what you think. Because I know lynching and everything else are primary examples, but we can go think deeper than that. What do you believe a system does when it has to control a majority who it does not want to share power with? What does it have to do to maintain its authority? In order to answer that, we have to move beyond the imagery of slavery. And we have to understand that the plantation was a system rather than just a period. You get the theme over the last 2 weeks. These are systems. These are Americanized systems, no more important than the systems that you go to work with every day at your job. The plantation was not simply a place of forced labor. See, we're told that in history. We're told it in history books in school. It was an organizational model that disciplined, restricted time, controlled movement, regulated behavior, and then its most important function, extracted value while minimizing those who worked in it, while not giving them autonomy. When slavery formally ended, those systems did not just disappear. They were adopted into other aspects of life in the Americas. They were adapted into sharecropping, where Black families farm land they did not own under contracts that were often used to keep them in perpetual debt and slavery and other forms of slavery. And in debt, it kept them down and held them to the system and the structure, where economic obligations bound laborers to landowners under threat of legal penalty and imprisonment. Again, another form of slavery. When we look at convict leasing, which we've talked about many times in history of erudition, that extended further, allowing states to arrest individuals under real broad enforced laws and then lease them as people to private industries, effectively recreating forced labor under a new legal framework. The systems didn't go away. So now you ask yourself this: if the system changes its name, but the outcome remains the same, has that system ever really ended? Did it end or did it evolve? Because that's what we're talking about here. A constant maintaining and evolution that still affects us today. What makes the system more complex and more difficult for people to fully grasp is that it did not rely solely on violence. And that's another issue I want to discuss tonight. Even though, violence was there and it is still present and it is still powerful. No, its main power, right, is a required coordination across institutions, city, state, and federal. Law enforcement enforced vagrancy laws and minor infractions at their level. Courts upheld contracts that disadvantaged Black laborers to fall under the control of the owners of the land. And it failed to protect their individual citizen rights. Local media, the newspapers of the time, and the media even of today, shaped narratives that justified the disparities, criminalized Black folks, said that they deserve what they got. Employers who weren't necessarily in the fields of the sharecropping fields reinforced economic dependency by limiting opportunities outside of the controlled labor structure that they owned. Only certain Blacks could work in the town or downtown or in the city. And those were prestige jobs, and you had to bow your head and do certain things in order to keep those jobs. So when we describe the South during this period, we're not describing just racial chaos. No, we're describing racial order. And that's a distinction that matters because order implies intention. Order implies agency and thought. That's important. I want you to think about this carefully. If outcomes are consistent across different counties, different cities, throughout different decades and different circumstances, do you still call it a coincidence? I asked you all this last week. Is that a coincidence? Or do you begin to recognize that it's systemic? It is a system at work. I want you to understand that because we so often throw out that word systemic without really breaking it down. I want you to come away tonight with it broken down for you with an understanding. I want you to understand. Because see, this becomes even more clearer as we move further and closer into our current time in the mid-20th century. When following the Supreme Court's decision and Brown versus Board of Education, remember, that legally challenged segregation in public education. Mississippi did not respond passively. And they weren't solely alone in their social resistance, but they do stand out. No, Mississippi responded structurally by creating the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. What is that? It was a government-funded entity designed to resist integration and monitor those, listen to what I said there, monitor those who supported civil rights, whether you were Black or white. This agency gathered intelligence on activists. It maintained files on individuals in and out of the state, coordinated with local officials, and it utilized both paid and unpaid informants, Black and white, to disorganize efforts to push integration. That is a system that is fighting back against anything coming in. That commission also worked to influence public opinion. And in a large amount of cases, it pressured, it incentivized. What do I mean by incentivized? It paid Black and white informants and members. Yeah, Black members. Right? To oppose integration initiatives. We have evidence and pay stubs of Black people, preachers, lawyers, doctors, store owners who participated and gave evidence and gave information to the Sovereignty Commission. And I want you to think about that. If your government is willing to fund surveillance and disruption of its own citizens in order to maintain a racial order or system, what does that tell you about how important that order and system was to be preserved? What were they getting from it? What was it providing them? And I don't just mean psychologically, even economically. When you parallel this to the White Citizens Council, that also emerged as another powerful force that operated through economics and social channels. They didn't use overt violence. That wasn't the first go-to. Now, they comprised largely of business leadership, professionals, and civic figures. These councils used employment pressure, credit denial, public messaging. That's what they did. They did social isolation of anybody who chose to interact with Blacks. They used that to enforce racial boundaries. While at the same time, they always wanted to look as if they were the respectable types. Now, they didn't rely on fear necessarily through violence. That wasn't their push. They normalized what was going on. They normalized the oppression as a consequence of everyday life. If they knew that a person was speaking out, they knew that they could cost them their job, their mortgage, their land, their social standing. They knew that they could put pressure on those folks enough to stop them from actually helping. See, then enforcement no longer needed to be constant because the example was done. Remember what I said earlier. What do you need to do? What do you need to show to make it internalized, to make it continuous? What is invisible pressure? It is something that shapes behavior before resistance ever begins. That's what it was. When we expand this analysis beyond Mississippi, we see similar patterns in Alabama, in the plantation regions of Louisiana. We see it in throughout the Mississippi Delta, in Florida. Now, see, the specifics may vary, but the underlying structure always remain the same. And what is often described as Southern culture, or racist mentality, got to be examined a little bit more critically than that. Because culture is not neutral when it determines who has access to livelihood, safety, ownership, and even a voice. And in many cases, what is labeled as racist culture function as a disciplined social order in order to preserve that system and that hierarchy through formal and informal means. I gave you 2 organizations that did that. So I want you to think about it honestly. When people talk about tradition or heritage or racist people in that context, what exactly is being protected? And realize that everybody didn't benefit from that protection. And then this leads us into the psychological dimension, which is often overlooked but essential in us understanding long-term impact. Living with a system where consequences or missteps or supporting something could include economic loss, physical harm, and sometimes through the Klan and others, death. What this produces is behavioral adaptations. Individuals learn to observe carefully, to not speak so quickly, and to anticipate what may get them hurt. In contemporary terms, we might describe aspects of that as hypervigilance or trauma-informed behavior, PTSD. But historically, those were seen as rational responses to the real conditions that were surrounding our ancestors. So then opens another question. If someone develops heightened awareness of their surroundings in an environment where danger is real, economically, mentally, socially, is that dysfunction? Or is that intelligence applied to survival? And over time, what does that survival mentality do to the people who have to maintain it 24/7? It's a hard life, and it's passed on. Because see, what happens is, what complicates that further is the transmission of these adaptations across generations into our children and our grandchildren. When one generation develops strategies for survival, those strategies are often passed down, consciously or unconsciously. They are given to the next generation over time. And then the original conditions that created those behaviors, they may shift and change, but the behaviors that you have taken on still persist. And if these behaviors are then interpreted without historical context, when the survival mentality, hypervigilance, the fear, right, is taken without context, they can be misunderstood and mischaracterized. And very often they are. They are. And if we don't ask ourselves, how often are these behaviors judged without any understanding of the environment that produced or created them generationally? And what does that say about how we study the psychology or the history? That's what systems do. They continue, they adapt, and they can be grown. The key point is that the American South was not simply a region where racism existed. It was a region where systems of control were constructed, they were maintained, they were normalized, they were given structure legally, economically, socially, and psychologically. And they affected both the whites and the blacks who lived in those constraints. These systems did not just shape outcomes in the moment. No, they shape expectations across our generations, and we're seeing it even in our generations today. So you have to ask, if a system is designed to control not just what people do, but what they believe is possible, what happens to those people over generations, even if they move, even if they leave? Do they leave the system behind? Does it stay with them? Does it become a part of them? And does that part of that system move with them into the next chapter, city, or whatever of their lives? That is what we have to look at, because I don't think we do enough strategic thinking in order to figure it out. No, we look at the terror as an enforcer, we look at the control, and those are things we should consider. But how it stays with us generationally is not often considered. Let me ask you something. Because this, and you ask, why do I ask questions? Because this is an interactive. I want you to put it in chat. I want you to speak about it, whether you're on Facebook, whether you're on YouTube. It is a good point that if a system is designed to control labor, movement, and opportunity, what happens? After all of that, what happens when you challenge that system? What happens when, despite all of its controls, you challenge it? Does the system just adjust to what you want, or does it respond? And see, if it responds, what tools does it use that are immediate and strong enough to reinforce its control before your resistance can grow? That's a point that we have to consider, because see, what we are going to get into, we're going to have to examine, is not random violence. See, we always go to the racial violence, and I understand it. It's a part of the history. But we forget that racial violence is how a system responds when control is threatened. And that distinction matters if we're going to look at this strategically and not just on surface level oppression. Because see, up to that point, we have established that the Southern structure was not built on isolated prejudice, right? But on organized control. So if we take the idea that that system was built on control, right? Any system built on control has a pressure point. And that pressure point is resistance. So when individuals begin to assert their autonomy, their agency, their independence, whether this be economic, whether this be political, whether this be social, that opposing system must respond in a way that not only suppresses that individuality, but also discourages others from even trying to follow that. And we see that throughout American Black history and even world Black history. When you examine historical record across any parts of the South, Mississippi, Texas, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, what we find is not a series of disconnected incidents, but a pattern of enforcement on all levels that operated through racial terror. If you don't want to believe this, because I get people often who push back in the comments, go look up the work of the Equal Justice Initiative. I think I spoke on this 3 weeks ago. What they do is they documented thousands of lynchings concentrated in the South between Reconstruction and the early 20th century. They numbered them. Even though they knew that the numbering may have been understated, they want what they could factually show you. Lynchings were always public. And sometimes they were announced in a newspaper. Why? So that large crowds could attend and see how the system enforced its control. So again, you have to ask that necessary question. If violence is carried out openly, on purpose, witnessed by communities, on purpose, rarely punished, what message, what control is actually being sent? And who is that message intended to reach? Because at that point, the act itself becomes less about the individual victim and more about how it can psychologically impact an entire population to not do whatever that individual was purported to have done. If you think about everything that we talked about earlier, if the system already controls courts, labor, and opportunity, then what role does violence actually play? See, it doesn't have to be the foundation. It is the reinforcement. That is what the Klan was. They weren't the White Citizens Council. They weren't the guys who dressed in suits. They were the enforcement. If the legal edge of the invisible structure, right, is the White Citizens Council, then that sharp edge is the Klan. Victims were often individuals who just simply were seen to have challenged some part of the social system, whether they be economic, social, or whatever. And the purpose was not merely just punishment. That's another thing that we confuse. It wasn't just punishment. It was demonstration. We're going to demonstrate to you why you should never do this. It was designed to demonstrate and create a memory. Because, see, memory is powerful because memory shapes behavior long after the violent event itself is past. If you burn your hand as a child on a stove, you know never to touch a hot stove. So you have to consider that an entire community witnesses consequences, black and white, for stepping over some systemic line, some system line. How long does it take before these consequences no longer need to be repeated as frequently? Because, see, the lesson is already taught. Don't do that. Don't walk on the same sidewalk as a white man. Don't meet his eyes. The lesson has already been learned. That's why it was demonstration. Let's take it one step further. If they were isolated, you might look at some of the local instability and just call it, just things happening in those areas. But when similar outcomes appear all throughout the South, then you start to realize that this is a system. This is actually something deeper than that. When we look at similarities, say the Elaine massacre of 1919, right? In Texas, the Slocum massacre, or we go to North Carolina and we look at the Wilmington coup of 1898, all of which we've talked about on this channel many times before. We're no longer dealing with isolated incidents. We are looking at a system responding consistently every time to perceived threats. And who are the threats? Black, economic, independent, political organization, or labor resistance, or people who simply don't want to take your drama anymore. And they are going to be the consistent perceived threats. And you have to keep them down. Because, see, that consistency matters, because consistency creates predictability, and predictability in this context creates fear. And that fear creates the control. That's what we're looking at. I'm trying to take you through this to think deeper, because the system did not only operate externally. We always look at the external. It operated internally as well. If violence is unpredictable in its timing, but predictable in its lack of consequence for the people who initiate the violence, it creates a specific type of psychological environment. People began to anticipate risk even when it's not immediately present. They warn their kids about it. They constantly think about it. They begin to measure their words, adjust their behaviors, where they go and what they do. They monitor the surroundings in ways that are not always conscious. Let me say that again. They monitor their surroundings in ways that are not always conscious. What does that mean in modern terms? How do we see that? Scholars in psychiatry would describe aspects of this as chronic stress exposure. These are real psychological things. Adaptive vigilance, trauma-enforced response patterns. But if we had to be precise, these were not just pathologies in the moment. They were rational adaptations to violence as systemic conditions that could get people hurt, harmed, killed. So let me ask you this. If your heightened awareness increases your chances of survival in a dangerous environment, again, is that dysfunction? Or is it the intelligence that has to be shaped by your environment as a necessity? I want you to consider this, because we look at Black life and say, well, why do they always act like that? Why do they always see things as bad? Why do they seem like they're always hyperactive, hypervigilant? Where does that come from? Because it becomes more complex and often more uncomfortable when we discuss it. A lot of people tell me, oh, here you go whining again. Here you go telling us this stuff again. But they haven't dug deep enough. Because see, when these adaptive behaviors persist across time, they again, as we said in the earlier part of this conversation, they shape identity. If a person grows up in an environment where caution is necessary, where speaking too much carries risk, where your success can attract violent attention, and where trust must be measured carefully because it could cost you your life, then you have to sit there and say, those behaviors do not simply disappear when conditions change. I adapt them as my way of life. They are carried forward, taught to our children, reinforced through our experiences, through our stories, through our life stories. They are embedded into how individuals and communities navigate the world. It doesn't matter if we left the South and went to the North. It stays with us. When we observe behaviors such as guardedness, hyper-awareness, distrust of institutions, that is heavy within the Black community. I don't trust doctors. I don't trust the government. I don't trust politicians, or even internal conflicts within communities. I don't trust dude. I don't trust the neighbor. I don't trust this person. We're looking at inherent traits. We're looking at responses to historical conditions that have been passed down and were never fully resolved. Not that it's wrong, but it has affected us. There's also an internal tension that develops with systems like this, and this is something that is rarely addressed, and I wanted to address it tonight. When survival depends on navigating power structures that are hostile or unpredictable, individuals are often forced into difficult positions. Some resist openly, some comply outwardly while resisting quietly. Some seek proximity to power as a form of protection. They sell out. And some are placed in positions where their survival or advancement is tied to maintaining aspects of the abhorrent system itself. I'm going to take a job here, and I know this is a horrible system. I know that they preach racism. I know that this party or place or community does this, but I need to be a part of it because in it, I may find protection that others don't have. So let me ask you, when people make choices under pressure, under threat, under constraint, how do we all evaluate those choices? Do we do it fairly? Do we judge them in isolation? Or do we consider the environment that shaped them? Because I'm going to tell you, we don't. We make prejudiced judgments on why people in the ghetto or why certain people do the things that they do, other than trying to connect with them to stop and let them understand that they're doing this out of this tension that the system has developed. This is where the concept of internal and external struggle begins to intersect. Externally, the system imposes limits and consequences. We talked about that. Internally, individuals and communities must reconcile their survival with identity, with resistance and safety, and progress with risk. They have to make a decision on how far they're going to go or how far they're not going to go. And in time, this produces a conflict, not just between groups, but within the communities themselves. And we see that even today. If advancement carries risk, if visibility attracts attention, and if trust is uncertain, then cooperation can become complicated. So I have to adjust. And it comes right back to that. How does a system maintain control, not only through external pressure, but by creating conditions internally that turn us against each other? Disrupts that internal cohesion so that your life becomes more difficult. You start to sectionalize yourself as something different from others. If we were to look at that in this reality, while Black communities may experience sustained violence in navigating through those conditions, broader society often started to promote narratives of inherent Black criminality and aggression. We're too aggressive. We're too violent. We're too sexualized. This creates a powerful contradiction. On one hand, historical evidence shows that Black individuals were disproportionately victims of violence, lynchings, beatings. But on the other hand, they were portrayed as sources of danger. So what does that do to perception? Because if a group is both subjected to the violence and then labeled as the violent, it becomes easier to justify on both sides a controlled system. Do you get that? That's what it does. Who benefits from that narrative? And how does it reinforce the system that we've been discussing throughout this broadcast? And we cannot ignore the emotional context of it, the emotional cost of living within a structure like that. Because if you are exposed to violence, even indirectly, it affects how you process safety, belonging, and feeling included. And while I'm not going to disagree with you and I say that, you shouldn't be careful, you need to be. But while we have to be careful, we also have to understand why we feel that way. We shouldn't retroactively diagnose entire populations, right, as violent. But I point that out tonight, the psychology of it, because modern research on trauma helps us to understand that repeated exposure to these threats, instability, right, it causes problems. It influences mental health outcomes. The amount of anxiety in the Black community, depression and stress, and other related behaviors that go undiagnosed or untreated. But if we even go beyond clinical definitions, there's a simpler truth here. Living under sustained pressure changes how people see the world. You don't trust. It changes how you see yourself. So how do you measure the impact of a system, not only in economic terms, but in human terms? We have to ask those questions, and I hope you all respond to those questions. We need to hold on to that understanding. Racial terror in the South was not separate from the system. It was a part of how the system maintained itself, shaped behavior, influenced decision-making, and left psychological and social and physical imprints that extended beyond the immediate moment. And if a population lives under sustained conditions like that, where advancement can trigger punishment, where safety is uncertain, and where identity is shaped under pressure, what happens? Even when you decide to leave, do you leave those conditions behind entirely? Do they no longer have an effect on you? Do they carry forward in the lessons and stories and adaptions and things you tell your children? Do these unresolved tensions follow you from one place to the next? Do they follow your family from one place to the next? And many of us don't pay attention to that. And I keep stressing that point because last week I talked about the Great Black Migration and how people felt they were escaping. But if a people have lived under a system where advancement can make them a target, where safety is uncertain, even in a place where the law cannot be trusted to protect them, what does leaving actually do for their psyche? What does leaving actually mean? Does leaving mean freedom? Does it mean choosing a place where you're no longer going to be oppressed? Or does it simply mean choosing a different kind of burden? Because see, I hear about the migration and I understand why it happened. But if you approach it from a shallow point of history, you're not going to get a full understanding. History tells that the Great Black Migration was a success story. It was a movement from darkness into opportunity, right? People left the racist South and went to the modern North. But that simply isn't the truth. That's not the fact. Where the fact is, the Great Black Migration was one of the largest internal movements of people in American history. And it did involve roughly maybe 6 or 7 million Black Americans moving out of the South. And it's for a long period, from as early as the 1910s and as late as the 1970s. People left in search of safety. People left because they wanted better wages. People left because they wanted their kids to have better education. People left because they wanted to get away from Jim Crow. But see, here's the thing, and I tried to explain this last week too. Migration is not only movement, it's a rupture. What does a rupture mean? It means it's a break in the continuity of life. Something broke down. It's a dislocation because you are removed from your familiar social and cultural environments. You are removed from those things that may have nurtured you, grown you, helped you, family and whatever. And in that, it should always be approached as a moment of grief. Grief in motion. Though it is a strategy, and it was a good strategy under pressure, it was not as always effective. And it was survival that did not erase the wounds. We have to understand that what people left behind wasn't just land. It wasn't just family. It was church networks. It was burial grounds. It was cultural memory. It was places of mutual recognition. It was places where there was a shared understanding of who I am, who I could trust, and where I belonged in my family, in my life, and in my community. And that matters psychologically, physiologically. It matters because it shapes who you are. When you hear people say, why didn't they just leave? They often speak as if leaving was merely a change of address. That mean that leaving was the all that be all the solution. But the people who leave under pressure are not simply relocating. They're not just moving. They're not just migrating. They are severing ties. Oral histories and primary sourced history collections show us that migrants left behind a lot. They left behind who they were because of violence, humiliation, exploitation. Yes, there were blocked opportunities. Yes, there was violence. They left all of that behind, but they left so much more. When we look at the materials that we can see in history, they emphasize that the move carried a lot of hardships, uncertainty, and there was a disorientation after they arrived wherever they were going. They had to readjust, relearn, and some never could. That's the other part we leave out. So I want you to sit with the idea and the question that is deeper. When a family leaves a place where it's dead, it can't survive, it's been repressed, when they leave a place where their families were, where their children were raised, where their dialect is from, where their customs were from, where everything that they know about themselves, their church life, their understanding, has that family merely moved, or has it entered a kind of exile? Has it separated from the ones it loves and the home and the identity that it has under pressure rather than pure choice? The Bible shows us that when people were taken into Babylon, that wasn't a choice. That was isolation. That was exile. That is why the Great Black Migration has to be understood as not only as an economic and freedom move, but through psychological and social meaning. The migrant did not step into the train as a blank slate. These were people. He or she stepped onto that bus, that train, or whatever with memory, with vigilance, with calculation, with ideas already formed by the South. And now, through modern times and the further understanding, we can now recognize that they took trauma with them. They took trauma with them. It was a trauma-consistent pattern. And what does that mean? It means behavior shaped by exposure to repeated stress or threat. We've talked about that several times on purpose in this. It didn't vanish when people crossed a state line. It didn't vanish when they got to where they were going. If a person had learned in Mississippi or Alabama that visibility could invite punishment, and they had grown up with that disrespect for towards white people could be deadly, that the wrong word or wrong look could cost you a job or even your life. Those lessons didn't disappear when you went to Chicago, Detroit, New York. Yeah, they didn't just disappear. The APA explicitly recognizes that African Americans carry public narratives of historical trauma. It's a fact. And that means that our collective psychological impact has been passed across generations, tied to events like slavery, lynching, exile, violence. The research that has been done on discrimination, on racial violence, shows a constant awareness and anticipation of a potential threat. That's passed down to our children. Even when we drive cars and think we're going to get stopped by the police, there's always that idea of a potential threat. And it shows that coping through this state of mentality is linked to stress and health burdens. That's why anxiety is so heavy in the Black community. So the question is not whether people carried something north. The real question is, could they not? Could they not take something with them? And that burden was not only mental, it was bodily. How many of your family members have high blood pressure, diabetes, chronic stress, meaning long-term activation of the body's stress responses, has physiological consequences? Research has been done to show, right? The exposure to stress accelerates physical aging. I talked about it many weeks ago about the allostatic load. The allostatic load is the cumulative effect, the wear and tear on the body throughout your life from repeated stress. From repeated stress. And what that study, what it shows, what it argues, that repeated exposures to racialized stress, to racialized violence, to historical narratives and ideas, they damage biological systems over time. And now studies are showing that we can connect race-related vigilance with sleep disruption, with long-term health risks, with hypervigilance. I got to get to this job, even though I'm never late. I'm never late. I'm never the one that causes any problems, but I'm Black. And if I don't get there, I know they'll fire me first. So when we discuss the Great Black Migration, when we discuss our ancestors, we cannot reduce it to jobs and housing. We must consider what was taken along from the South, from that oppression, from that pressure, from slavery, right? And we have to look at the elevated vigilance. We have to look at the sleep disruption. We have to look at the stress hormone imbalance. We have to look at these diseases that are potentially more common in the Black community. The body learning to remain in readiness, to remain in survival. If stress becomes a constant state rather than a temporary reaction, what does that do to your body and your mind? your need to take drugs, to drink, to reduce the stress. What does it do to you over time, culturally? Before we move further, let's do something else. Let's add faith to that picture. I know some of you are not church-going people, and I get that from folks who get in the comments, because faith is not a side issue in the Black migration. It was infrastructure. And what does that mean? It was a system that supports and sustains life. It's what they needed to take that trip. The Black church did not simply provide emotional comfort. Back then, it organized movement. It recognized migrants. And it translated suffering into meaning. It gave them the idea that there was a purpose for this. It offered housing connections, job information. It gave people a chance to feel social belonging after being exiled into another area. Historical documents show that migrants often follow what we call trust lines. That's why they went to certain places, certain cities more than others. Routes shaped by relationships rather than geographic lines. Newspapers like the Chicago Defender helped spread information about northern opportunities. Church groups and churches served as receiving stations for new arrivals. So I want you to think about that. If formal systems were closed and you were isolated and ran away from because of hostility, what does it mean for people to build their own system of support rooted in faith and community? What would that mean to them? It meant a lot. And even though faith couldn't erase the strain of dislocation, the fact of the pain of being dislocated from your family for long periods, cultural expectations shifted. Migrants came to the city speaking that Southern talk. They adapted their speech, their behavior, and even their worship styles to the new environments. We know this because we can look at the firsthand knowledge of Black religious life in northern cities that show that migrants sometimes face tension even from within other Black communities. And so they went to places where they could feel comfortable. I ask a lot of questions in this because what does it mean to a person to leave a place where they were controlled, arrive in a place where they were needed for labor, and still be told, even though it may be subtle, that they do not fully belong? They had to find these connections. Migration was important. Yes, but it cannot just be seen as migration. It was not just movement. It was translation. Black people had to translate themselves into another system, from one system into another. The South taught vigilance through open terror, through their system. The North reinforced vigilance through structured exclusion a lot of times. The North had housing discrimination, labor limitations, and social boundaries also. And they had to adjust. It wasn't freedom. The Supreme Court case of Shelley versus Kramer is a good example of that. It addressed racial divided, restricted covenants, legal agreements that prevented Black families from purchasing homes in certain areas. So even when they came from the South, even if they had a little money that they had taken with them, they could only live in certain areas. So, and I talked about this last week. they were still restricted. So it wasn't all just, I'm going to freedom. And this is why I want you to think beyond the idea of movement as a progress alone. It's not. The Great Black Migration was necessary. It was necessary. It was strategic. It saved lives, but it also carried trauma. It had an emotional cost. It had a physical cost. It had a social cost. It had a generational cost that we're still seeing today, because it shaped how people trusted, how they built relationships, how they viewed opportunity. It shaped how they prepared their children for the world after them, and then their children's children. So we have to look at it as a system as we move forward. And I want you to think about it that way. You have to. If the Great Black Migration was both escape and wound, if it was both a hope and a rupture, as we called it earlier, if it was strategic, but it also required sacrifice, then what exactly did the North inherit? What did the North inherit from the South? Did it inherit a free people starting over? Or did it inherit a people who were still not recovered from the violence, the trauma, the unfair treatment? People who were still living with a hypervigilance and a survival mode. People who were struggling with faith. People who had unresolved pressure, who moved into environments that would shape them all over again and have to then take on another form of survival and understanding as they moved into this new space. That's real. And that is what happened. I think we don't focus enough on those northern realities, and how they affected us. Because, see, people can leave a system of open racial control. They can carry the memory and the vigilance and the faith and everything that we talked about. But do they finally find freedom, or do they encounter different systems? And if they do, what do those systems do to them? How do they also change them? Because we have a habit of saying the North was a solution, and the North was not a solution. When Blacks arrived in cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Philadelphia, they did not step into open access societies. They entered environments structured by what we now can define as systemic exclusion. This was organized limitation embedded in their housing, their employment, and their public life. They were restricted. I talked about this last week, and where they moved, where they lived. Redlining, different things like that, a practice of which they told you where you could live. It wasn't always overtly violent, but it definitely kept you in your place. When we look at cases like Shelley versus Kramer, which determined that courts could not enforce racially restrictive covenants, you know, those things that barred Black families from purchasing homes in certain areas. But see, by that time, the damage had already been done. The social order had already been established. Segregation had already been mapped, reinforced, and normalized. Housing patterns were not simply social preferences. They were structured outcomes. They were structured. So if a law changes, but the system that produced the inequality remains intact and remains the same, how much actually changes for the people living within it? Who's going to enforce that law? when society scoffs it. Same thing with labor, because this is where the connection to the South becomes even clearer. Black migrants were welcomed to the northern city largely by warehouses and labor, particularly during periods like World War I and World War II, when there was a demand for industrial work, and that demand increased. It was also important to consider that was also when European immigration declined during World War I and World War II. America didn't want the Germans. It didn't want the Jews. It didn't want the Italians. It didn't want those people over here. So being welcome as labor is not the same as being accepted as an equal participant in society. Black workers, they came in, they funneled into the lowest paid jobs, worked the longest hours, the most physically demanding jobs. They weren't given a lot of upward mobility, promotion status. No, it was a labor stratification, a system where different groups were channeled into different levels of work, and compensation was based on social hierarchy and not your ability. So when you hear these people talk about DEI and talk about merit, no, America has always put a labor stratification program. So what does that mean? That means if people are trained under one system to endure hard labor for survival and then placed in another labor system that rewards endurance but limits advancement, what does that labor force adjustment do to them over time? How does it affect their thinking? What we call the plantation mentality, right? Because this evolves into something more precise. What we are seeing is not mentality in a simplistic sense, but behavioral conditioning shaped by historical necessity. Generations of Black workers had already learned discipline in the South under coercive systems, under violence conditions, punctuality under threat, endurance under pressure, and productivity under surveillance. When those same behaviors are transferred into an industrial environment, they become economically valuable to the employer in the North, who may be just as racist as those in the South. Because in the end, it does not translate into ownership or control. Let me say that again. It does not translate into ownership or control. You don't control your destiny. So I want you to think about that. If a system benefits from your labor but restricts your ability to accumulate wealth from that labor, and I talked about this last week, it is opportunity. But is that also containment? You're given the opportunity to work, but you can't grow. You can't grow further. Social environments, because economics alone does not explain what followed, what happened. A Black population increased in the northern cities. Millions migrated. Segregation intensified, often through informal enforcement, such as neighborhood hostilities, neighborhood isolations, some violence, and real estate steering. Overcrowding became common in restricted neighborhoods. What did that do? It created a stressful condition that extended beyond economics, beyond what you could earn. And this is where we begin to connect environmental stresses, the psychological and physiological strain caused by living in dense, unresourced, where they didn't put anything into your community, and highly surveilled environments where the police are always there. So let me ask you, if people leave one system of pressure under only to enter into another one that compresses them physically, socially, and economically, What do you think that does to their long-term stability in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years? That chronic exposure to stress we talked about earlier, that allostatic load, that cumulative burden that is placed on the body, what does it do to our physical bodies, to our mental mind, to our children's mental mind, to our children's physical body? When people and families navigate environments shaped by these historical traumas, and these things become constant, even into our present day constraint, they develop coping strategies. And what does that include? These can include heightened awareness, as we said, emotional restraint, distrust of people around you, mental breakdowns, violence. They're adaptive responses. And what does that mean? Those are behaviors that develop in response to environmental conditions. Why am I overtly violent? Why am I doing these things violently? Because you have put me in a stratified, compressed society. You told me what I could not do, and I have no way of getting out of it. Consider the Chinese finger trap, and you can't get out. Consider being in handcuffs, and you can't get out, and you're vulnerable to everything around you. Before they ever put you in that constraint, you're going to do things that you feel can keep you out of that constraint. That may mean dealing drugs. That may mean violence. That may mean, and these are not excuses. These are generational things and adaptive responses that we have to look at. So ask yourself, when you observe behavior without understanding its origin, are you seeing the person, or are you seeing the condition that shaped them? Because that will give you an idea of how you can address it. I'm going to break this episode off, and we're going to do a part 2 to this, because there's so much to upload, so much to talk about. I want us to start looking at these things in the condition that they are, not just the surface level racism. Because see, here's the thing. Internal community dynamics are more complex than that. When resources are limited, when opportunities are constrained, when stress is a constant, competition is increased, people's ideas and assumptions grow, this can lead to conflict, mistrust, fragmentation of the family, not because of just anger, but because of the pressures internally and externally put upon you. That's the real dynamics of racism, of bigotry, of xenophobia. And we got to go back to that. How does a system maintain control, not only through external pressure, but by creating conditions where internal unity becomes even more difficult to sustain? Where that pressure makes some snap. That pressure convinces some that violence is the only way. And narrative shapes that too. Narrative is one of the most powerful tools in the Black community, but it is also one of the most powerful tools in maintaining systems. Because see, as Black people, we're navigating all of the things that we talked about, all of those conditions. There were narratives being given. There are narratives being given about us with the idea of criminality, dysfunction, over-sexualization. And this is where you have to look at something like social narrative construction. What is that? That is the process in which dominant groups shape public perception to justify your existing condition. And it's a contradiction. If a community is placed under economic strain, if it's restricted on where it moves and it's under constant surveillance, and then at the same time, it's labeled as inherently problematic and that they can't be trusted. What does this narrative accomplish? It shifts responsibility away from the racist system and onto individuals. Now we don't look at the system that created these abnormalities. We look at the individual as to blame. And we do that a lot. We do that a lot. It's not saying people don't have agency. But after 50, 60, 70, sometimes 100 years of restriction and oppression, what do you think is going to happen to the generations that come after that? And if we lack in faith, as a Black church used to be a place where communities could function and have some form of resistance and feel some form of connection. It used to provide a framework and understanding that this suffering, as I said earlier, had made sense. Faith makes you have to have reconciliation. You have to reconcile what you're going through with your belief. You have to trust God. You have to reconcile what is your survival along with what is my purpose? What am I here for? So that you don't just live through suffering without meaning. That is the strength of that got a lot of our ancestors through. What does it mean for people to maintain faith, not in the absence of suffering, but in the presence of it while going through it? And how does that faith shape their response to the systems that continue to constrain them? How do they survive? And when you bring all of that together, economic restriction, labor exploitation, environmental stress, physiological strain, psychological strain, narrative distortion, faith is important. Because what you also begin to see is not simply a story of a people, of a culture, but you also start to understand, I hope you got that tonight, a transferred pressure that is consistently and continually being transferred on to the next generation who don't know who they are, who don't know their history, who doesn't participate in their history. Tonight we talked about how the South created the conditions and then how the North then absorbed the people and the condition, but did not remove the pressure. If anything, it benefited from the pressure. It redistributed it. It helped them to reshape it into jobs, into a functional job center by putting them in the projects, by putting them in low-income housing. It embedded them into urban environments that would later be misunderstood, later translated as the violent places, places of dysfunctionality, places of criminality, and forgetting how they were historically constructed. I'm going to come back next week and we're going to talk a little bit more about this. This has been an hour and a half. I don't want to make this too long. But I wanted us to go into this tonight because it is so important that we start to break these systems down. And tonight I want you, whatever you watch this, I want you to sit with everything that we talked about so far and realize we didn't just talk about racism. We didn't just talk about the Southern strategy or the racism of the South. We didn't just talk about history. We broke down a system. And we talked about this system's cost. It's controlled labor. It's enforced order through violence. It's how it adapted people as they moved. How it influenced us, shaped our perception, and showed that it didn't end, it just merely evolved. Because once you understand the system, you can stop misdiagnosing the outcome. You can start moving to doing something different. Once you understand the history and get a understanding of the context of the history, the deeper context, then we can start trying to solve the actual problem and not just give it small remedies. Let me ask you before we leave tonight. How do you fix something you don't fully understand? That's the most important question I'm going to ask you tonight. How do you fix something you don't fully understand? So you've been given the top layer of history. That's not what we do here on Erudition. How do you challenge what you can't really conceive? How do you move forward if you don't ever recognize the structure that you're standing upon? That is why we go so deep with this. That's why we don't give you just a surface level history. And I tell you, people get mad about it. They send me things in chat and I hear it all the time. I don't care. Because that right here is why the Erudition Network exists. We're not here to repeat surface level history. We are not here to give you just flapping tongue arguments and opinions. We are here to teach you fact-based history at a deeper level. That's what I do. And we're going to provide you sources. We're going to provide you structure. We're going to tell you what the system is, and we're going to give you the context so you can actually understand what you're looking at, not only as just a racist system or just as an economic system, but something deeper. I ask you that if tonight did anything for you, if it made you think differently, question something, or connect dots that you hadn't connected before, then I need you to share this video. I need you to engage. I need you to go share it with those who are out there that you know. I need you to drop comments and ask questions. I need you to let us know what part of tonight's breakdown changed the way you think the most. What question that I asked do you now have a better understanding for? Maybe you didn't know to ask before. Because see, that's how we learn together, which is a part of what we say here. Through thinking, through questioning, through sharpening each other. I need you to do that. Stay connected with us. Follow us on Facebook. Get off of here tonight. After you click the bell and you join and subscribe. Go on to Facebook where we break down the same thing in real time using historical facts, not opinions. Subscribe like here on YouTube, right? Like I said, we're starting a new community on School where we're putting questions for every live. There will be a way that reinforce your knowledge. That's where the real interaction will happen. When you don't want to watch, you learn, you challenge, you grow. That way, you're not just repeating what is being said. You have sources and places to go to learn on your own. And if you feel one of those people that feel you got to get your hands on something, that you got to read something, go out there and get the Erudition Network Presents 101 Black History Questions, Early World. It's not a passive read. Go on Amazon and get the digital copy. It's an interactive read. It's a challenge. It's going to force you to think through ancient civilizations, Look at actual knowledge, global Black history, and early world systems. It's going to ask you about places like Kush, Carthage, Exum, the Indus Valley people. It's going to push you to ask questions and verify things you probably didn't even know you should understand. Because see, knowledge and history is not something that you just hear. Because if that happens, it just fades. Knowledge is something that you work through. Why? Because then it'll stay. That's what we're about. That's what we do here. So I'm going to leave. I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to get off my soapbox. But I really wanted you to sit with that. And we're going to come back next week and we're going to cover a couple of more sections of this system that we call racism in America or in the South. But if the system we broke down tonight was built over generations, maintained through law, culture, perception, and pressure, then what would it actually take to dismantle it? That's what we're going to try to look at next week. What does it take to build something better over it, to stop it, to counter that system? And where do you fit, me and you, in that process? Because see, once we understand where we are in that process, then we can start to understand how we can counter it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us and being with us tonight. I love to hear from you, all of you who have sent in comments and whatnot. Please continue to do that. You can also support the Erudition Network. You see at the bottom our Cash App. It trickles on the bottom. Whatever you do, 5, 10, 15, or whatever you do is appreciated to help grow this network and its importance. And I hope you see its importance. This is the Erudition Network, where we grow knowledge and understanding. And I hope to see you guys in the comments. You all be blessed and have a great rest of your weekend. You'll see a short advertising for the book that I just talked about. Go out there and get that book this weekend. Grow your knowledge. Be blessed, family. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
From Eddie K. Phillips, founder of the Erudition Network, comes 101 Black History Questions, a groundbreaking book that challenges what you thought you knew and uncovers the stories history tried to hide. Perfect for classrooms, families, and curious minds. Get the digital copy today on Amazon.